The Galactic Armed Forces training compound on Kareth 4 was not built for human comfort. Commander Kale Veyron had designed it that way intentionally. 47 species trained within its walls, Vrelians with their triple-jointed limbs, Sockeye with heat-sensing membranes, Karathi whose resting heart rate made most species feel like they were dying. The compound was built to test all of them. And still, in 6 rotations of running the program, no trainee had ever made Kale nervous. Until Mara Ellison walked through the gates. She arrived the way all humans did, smaller than expected, softer looking than the file suggested. Kale had read her record 3 times before orientation. Born on Harkins Ridge, a frontier colony on a Class 4 death world. Tectonic instability. Megafauna. Atmospheric toxin spikes every 87 days. Average life expectancy for colonists, 54 standard years. Average life expectancy for colonists who stayed outside after dark, considerably less. She had grown up outside after dark. The file listed her qualifications in cold bureaucratic language, survival certifications, marksmanship scores, field medicine hours, but what Kale kept returning to was the psychological evaluation. The interviewing officer had written, in the notes section usually reserved for red flags. Subject demonstrates an unusual relationship with stress. Recommend monitoring. That was it. No elaboration. Kale had flagged it. He'd received no response. The first week, Mara said very little. This was not unusual. Many trainees went quiet under pressure, especially the first days when the compound's artificial gravity was cranked to 1.3 standard and the food rations were cut to 80% and the sleep cycles were interrupted at random intervals. The Sockeye complained loudest. The Vrelians filed formal grievances. The Karathi, who needed less sleep than anyone, simply looked smug. Mara ate her rations, completed her drills, and looked out at the training yard with an expression that Kale couldn't quite classify. His species, the Thyrac, read emotion through microfluctuations in skin pigmentation. Humans didn't have that. They were harder to read. But even accounting for that, there was something specific about the way she watched things. Not boredom. Not anxiety. Calculation. The incident happened during week 3, during the high-stress adversarial simulation, what the trainees had taken to calling the grinder. The exercise was simple in structure, brutal in execution. Trainees were dropped into a mock urban environment, separated from their units, and given one objective: reach the extraction point within 4 hours. The compound's AI would coordinate opposition, simulated hostiles, environmental hazards, cascading failures in equipment. The point was not to see if they could succeed. The point was to see how they broke. Every trainee broke eventually. That was the data Kale was collecting. The shape of the breaking told him everything about what kind of soldier they'd become. Mara was assigned to Group 7. She was the only human in her group. The others, 2 Vrelians and a Karathi named Thessa, had already established a working dynamic in previous exercises. They were competent. They would probably make good soldiers. Kale watched the feeds from the monitoring room. The first hour went normally. Group 7 moved through the mock cityscape with reasonable efficiency. Thessa took point, natural for a Karathi, whose reflexes processed input 40% faster than most species. The Vrelians, Dor and Kel, handled the flanks. Mara stayed center, quiet, watching. At the 73-minute mark, the AI escalated. A simulated structural collapse cut off their primary route. Simulated communications dropped to 30% reliability. Then the AI deployed what Kale privately called the emotional battery, synthesized audio of distress signals, carefully tuned to each species' most destabilizing frequencies. The Vrelians slowed. Their file noted sensitivity to high-frequency acoustic stress. Expected. Thessa's movement became fractionally less precise. Also expected. Mara stopped walking. Kale leaned forward at his console. She stood in the middle of the simulated street, head slightly tilted, eyes moving. She wasn't frozen. She wasn't panicking. She was listening to the distress signals, to the simulated chaos, to something Kale couldn't identify from the feed. Her lips moved, very slightly. He turned up the audio. She was counting. Under her breath. In a steady, unhurried rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted to 11. Then she stopped, turned to Thessa, and said the first complete sentence Kale had heard her speak to a teammate. The collapse came from the north-northwest. The acoustic signatures are looping, same 40-second pattern. The hostiles are running a script, not responding to us. We have a window. Thessa stared at her. How did you? I grew up near fault lines, Mara said. You learn the difference between a building that's still falling and a building that's done. She was already moving. Follow me or don't. They followed her. She got them to the extraction point in 2 hours and 18 minutes. This was not, by itself, alarming. Groups sometimes performed ahead of projection. What alarmed Kale was the way she did it. She never raised her voice. She never ran unless she had to. When Door's equipment failed and the Vrelian began to show signs of acute stress response, Mara didn't offer reassurance, she handed him a task. A small one. Something achievable in 30 seconds. When he completed it, she handed him another. By the third task, Door's hands had stopped shaking. She identified 2 of the AI's simulated ambush positions before they were triggered, not because she'd been briefed on the compound's layout, she hadn't, but because she'd noticed the dust patterns were wrong, the shadow angles inconsistent with the light source, a detail Kale himself had never noticed in 6 rotations of running the same exercise. And when they reached the extraction point and Thessa let out a sharp, relieved exhale, Mara simply looked around the area with that same calculating expression and said, "There's another way in from the east. Faster. We should tell the next group." There was no triumph in her voice. No relief. Just information, offered plainly, because it was useful. Kale sat in the monitoring room for a long time after Group 7's feed ended. He pulled up Mara's biometric data from the exercise. Heart rate. Cortisol equivalent markers. Neural arousal indicators. The compound's medical sensors were sophisticated enough to track cognitive load in real time. He read the numbers. He read them again. Her stress indicators had been lower during the most intense portions of the exercise than during the orientation briefing on day 1. Not slightly lower. Significantly lower. He pulled up her file again. Read the psychological evaluation note one more time. Subject demonstrates an unusual relationship with stress. Recommend monitoring. The officer who'd written that had been imprecise. Kale understood now what they'd been trying to say and hadn't had the language for. Mara Ellison didn't respond to stress the way other species did. She didn't escalate. She didn't shut down. She focused. The worse the situation became, the more completely her attention narrowed onto the problem in front of her, stripping away everything irrelevant, until all that was left was her and the obstacle and the question of how to move it. She'd grown up on a death world. 47 years of average life expectancy. Outside after dark. She hadn't learned to fear the chaos. She'd grown up inside it, until her nervous system had simply accepted it as the baseline. As normal. As the water she swam in. Which meant that everything Kale's training program did to create stress, the sleep deprivation, the ration cuts, the acoustic batteries, the cascading failures, all of it was less intense than her childhood. He was trying to break her using conditions she'd spent her entire life treating as Tuesday. He sent the cancellation notice for the remaining 3 weeks of the grinder at 0200 the next morning. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Ferris, found him still at the console when the shift changed. The cancellation notice went out, Ferris said carefully. The other instructors are asking why. Tell them we're restructuring the curriculum. And if they want more detail? Cale was quiet for a moment, looking at the frozen image on his screen, Mara Ellison, standing in a simulated ruined street, counting quietly to herself while chaos played on loop around her, utterly still, utterly focused, already 3 moves ahead. Tell them, he said, that I've identified a gap in our threat assessment framework. He finally looked away from the screen. We've been designing these exercises to simulate the worst conditions our trainees have ever faced. He paused. We forgot to account for the possibility that one of our trainees had already survived something worse. Ferris followed his gaze to the frozen image. She didn't even complain. No, Cale said. She didn't. He closed the feed. She never said a word. In the barracks, Mara Ellison slept soundly through a simulated alarm test, the 3rd one that night, and did not stir once. She had grown up near fault lines. She knew the difference between danger and noise.